Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome back to our Equity Explorer webinar. I am Karena, an investment specialist at Fairtree, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So just to give you some insights on Equity Explorer, the series was designed as a teach-in on key themes in equity markets, offering deeper insights into industries, companies, and trends that are currently shaping global investments. So our goal here as Fairtree is to give you tools to better understand the forces that are driving markets and to highlight some opportunities. However, please do note that this is not financial advice and it does not represent a deep dive into our portfolios. With that, I'm very excited to introduce today's topic. It is on the evolution of the Kazakhstan's dynamic financial sector. We will spotlight some companies, mainly being Kaspi and Halyk. Please feel free to send through as many questions as you want during the presentation. We'll try to get to as many as we can, and if not, we'll get back to you via email. With that, I'd like to introduce Seipati, our analyst, who will be taking us through today's deep dive. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Karina. Just hi again to everyone else online. Thank you so much for joining today's session on our Equity Explorer. So in today's session, I will be taking you through two companies, Kaspi and Halyk, who have two different models but are operating in one market. So before we start, I'll give a quick view of the agenda and how we will be conducting today's session. So I'll start with an introduction to Kazakhstan's macro, as that is an important driver for the two companies. And then we'll go into trying to understand the two companies' models and how they operate. And then we look at the financial sector, the e-commerce landscape, where we'll also be introducing Kaspi as a super app. And lastly, I will be discussing just a few key financials. So before we go right into it, I thought this would be quite interesting because I, for one, did not know about Kazakhstan up until a few years ago when I started covering the stocks. But on Kazakhstan's Did You Know Today, is that it's actually the world's largest landlocked country. But landlocked can be debated because they actually do have a shoreline with the Caspian Sea, as you can see on the image. But another interesting thing is that they have a very diverse landscape and ethnic composition as well. A lot of people going into Kazakhstan, they actually go into the country for their tourism to just go see their lakes and mountains. It's very beautiful there. They also have two capitals, which is Astana and Almaty. And I recently, earlier this year, had an opportunity to go attend a financials and fintech conference in Kazakhstan with Morgan Stanley. So I was based in Almaty for most of the trip. And just on the fun side, if you didn't know, apples actually originated in Kazakhstan, and horse meat is a staple, just like what chicken would be for us. So just on the trip that I had just mentioned, a few key personal insights from the trip. I was quite impressed by how developed the country is. Just driving from the airport, going into the city Almaty, the roads, you can see it's very well developed. They also have a very well developed public transport system. There's also very well-known brands that are around as you walk around, like their malls. So a lot of brands that you'll be familiar with going into any other country. Just thought that was quite interesting. So as we're going to discuss today's session, just starting with the macro, Kazakhstan is known for its favorable demographics. So this can be seen in their steady population growth. So they are quite small in comparison to other emerging countries with a population of around 20 million. But birth rate per woman is around 2.8%. which is better than some other markets that are currently facing challenges when it comes to population growth. The population is also relatively young, which this will also speak to like how this has been positive for the labor force as well, given the urbanization rate as well. So population and demographics are quite favorable for the market. Given the steady population growth, we see this also in how productive they are versus peers. And I thought it would be quite interesting just to look at their unemployment rate, which compared to South Africa looks way better. But this does partly reflect like a resources driven economy. And I'll speak more on that as I go through the other slides, but also speaks to the steady growing labor force, as you would have seen with the relatively young population and the steady growth in the population. They also do have like a large informal sector. This also does drive positive employment growth. And another important thing as well is that the government is very involved in like driving training incentives and incentivizing programs for youth development and youth employment. So this has been quite positive for the market, but just speaks to how productive the population is in the country. And then if we looked at the real GDP growth year on year comparison, I mean, you can tell that excluding the external shocks that we have seen with the GFC in 2008, the oil price shocks between 2014 to 2016, and COVID in 2020, their GDP actually trends around 5%, and expectations are also around 4 to 5% GDP growth for the country, so which is quite positive. This also can be seen in looking at their GDP per capita versus other emerging countries. You can see the world average, which is like the green line there, versus where Kazakhstan is. So it far outpaces peers. And this speaks to the positive trends that I've already spoken in terms of the labor force, urbanization, and just the input per person in the country has actually increased, driven by the innovation in the country as well. An important factor as well for the country, I've mentioned that it's a resources-rich country, but just to give a bit of context, oil is very important for the country. It actually makes up around 35% of their GDP and makes up more than 50% of their exports. So increases or decreases in oil prices will be they drive the economy. So an example, as you would see in the graph, is just looking at the decrease in oil prices, and you would have seen like the steep devaluation in the Kazakhstan tenge, which is the currency that they use in Kazakhstan. It just comes to show how important of a driver this has been for their country. But it's not always positive. As you can see in 2020, oil prices don't always offset things like your geopolitical risks. As you would have seen, like in 2022 is around the time of the Russia-Ukraine war, but at the same time, the USD was quite strong. But generally, you do see the correlation between like your oil prices increase or decreases and the devaluation or revaluation of the Kazakhstan tenge. If we were to look at the current interest rate environment, which is very important for the two companies that I will be speaking about because they are in the financial sector, you would have seen that currently interest rates in Kazakhstan are at an all-time high at around 16.5%. This was in response to the rising inflation. So in February, the National Bank of Kazakhstan raised the base rate to 16.5%. And in June, again, they decided to just leave it at 16.5%. So this does reflect the ongoing inflation risk and the need for like more restrictive policies. But on our trip earlier this year, as I've spoken, we went to Kazakhstan. We did meet with the National Bank of Kazakhstan, and I think the main goal for them currently is to try stabilize or cool the domestic demand, just trying to strengthen the tenge just to like curtail any further inflation increases or inflation spikes. So it is currently a headwind for the financials, but eventually interest rates will go down and this becomes a tailwind for the companies that I'm speaking about today. And then just lastly on the macro, I thought it would be interesting also just to look at the fiscal spend flexibility. So I looked at the government debt as a percentage of GDP, and you can see that Kazakhstan's debt is at the lower end versus countries like the USA, Brazil, and South Africa. So this would mean that they have like low debt, like a low a debt service burden. So giving them more like fiscal spend flexibility and does allow for a bit of a buffer to external shocks. That can be debated, but it does allow for a bit of a buffer, and meaning that they can still stimulate also the economy in times where the macro is challenged. So this you also see on the ground actually when you are in the country and in Almaty with a lot of construction everywhere, like roads are expanding. So it is visible, not just in the government debt as a percentage of GDP, but you also actually see it on the ground. So now I'll be going to explaining the differences between Kaspi and Halyk and going into Kazakhstan's financial sector. So even though the two companies operate in Kazakhstan, they are quite different. They do have a few similarities there and there, but I will just start with Halyk just to give an overview of what they do. So Halyk is a legacy bank in Kazakhstan. They do your traditional consumer and corporate loaning and loans, and then the revenue is driven like any other traditional bank would be by interest income. And then the focus currently, they're mostly focused on Kazakhstan, so a very like domestic focus with more than 90% of their business coming from Kazakhstan. And then growth drivers would be an important one, which would be like credit expansion and also where the macro is currently in the country. And then when we look at Kaspi, so Kaspi is a lot more diversified than what Halyk would be. So Kaspi is a fintech, e-commerce, and payments platform. The fintech part of the business being banking, because they do have a banking license. So they also do like your consumer lending and consumer deposit as well. The difference between the banking side of Kaspi versus Halyk would be that Kaspi is more focused on like retail lending versus Halyk, which also does corporate loans as well. And then their revenues, most of the revenues comes from transaction fees and commissions. Because of the fintech leg of the business, they also do have interest income that also benefits them. And then their focus is that most of the business is based in Kazakhstan, so that's how most of the revenue is driven. But of recent, you would have, if you do know about the companies, they have recently acquired a business in Turkey. So they are looking to expand internationally as well. And then the growth drivers for the business, given how diversified they are, I think an important thing would be their ecosystem usage because this is a platform, and then also their cross-selling of products. And we'll speak a lot more about that when we go into the other slides. But just wanted to highlight the differences between the two companies. So, given that I've spoken about how one company is a traditional bank, and then although Kaspi is more diversified because of the fintech leg of the business, they are also like a bank. So it's quite important just to look at like how the market share looks like in the country. And if you were to look at the market share by bank assets, you can see that Halyk Bank has around 41% market share and Kaspi around 18%. So basically, the top three banks have high concentration in the market. This is a very highly concentrated market for the financials in Kazakhstan. And then if you look at like the composition of the bank credit, this speaks to the entire Kazakhstan market. You can see that individual loans, which would be like consumer loans, has increased over the years versus corporate loans, which has actually decreased. So it's a lot more challenged versus consumer loans. So the increase in consumer loans, I'll speak to that as well, just looking at how that has increased in absolute terms. But you can just think of the urbanization that I've already spoken about, with people now demanding more goods and services. Also, on the supply side, credit is very profitable for the banks, so that has been growing. A lot of digital products are now available, so that has also made it easier to get credit as well. And if you looked at like the loan portfolio composition for the entire market in Kazakhstan, most of the loans are consumer loans. And if we were to even go more granular, actually, other consumer loans represent about 2/3 of like commercial lending for the commercial lending banks. So consumer loans, I just wanted to highlight. It's very important and has been driving most of the credit growth for the country. So, just also reiterating what I had mentioned in the last slide, this just speaks to the growth in consumer loans. But if you look at it in absolute terms, you can see that there has been like a rapid growth in the last 3 or so years. This speaks to the growing urbanization, demands on goods and services, easier access to credit. An example would be the BNPL, which is like buy now, pay later product, which Kaspi offers, so making it easier for consumers to receive credit. But what has been interesting is that despite the increase in consumer credit, if you were to look at like the non-performing loans, actually that has improved from like your high 20% in 2014 to now around 3% for the industry average. So this has to do with some regulation that has been put into place, but it also just shows like positive. I think it's quite positive that they've seen like a decline over the years, so basically improvement. And if you were to look at the liquidity of the banking sector in Kazakhstan, it's actually quite liquid, with the capital adequacy ratios of around 18 and 19% for the banks and both the companies that I've actually spoken about now. And this also, I think, the consumer credit growth speaks to a growing middle class, as I have mentioned, with like the steady population growth and a relatively young population that's moving into the labor force as well. So keeping that in mind, we looked at the Kazakhstan's loan and deposit market share, and Halyk and Kaspi have dominant market share. You would have already seen with the pie chart that I had shown in terms of like financials that have market share when you look at the banking assets. But now we focus on the retail consumer loans, and you can see that Kaspi has a majority of the market share, followed by Halyk Bank, and then the rest of the others. The reason for this, especially because if you look at these graphs, Kaspi has a majority market share in retail consumer loans, but Halyk has majority market share in retail deposit. So it just speaks to the differences in their models. For example, Kaspi specializes in lending and offers products like BNPL. So these are more like point of sales loans, very easy access, and it's like interest-free loans that you can pay in installments. So loans that consumers could easily get, but the deposit retail market share just speaks to, I think, Halyk as a traditional bank and how they have the structure to take or to have more deposit taking capabilities versus versus Kaspi, sorry. So a consumer is able to go on the Kaspi platform and get a loan to buy whatever they're buying on the e-commerce platform, but they wouldn't necessarily want to maybe have like a deposit or save money with Kaspi. But this doesn't mean that Kaspi doesn't have any deposit products. As you can see, they also do have market share there, and they've actually of recent introduced like other deposit products to try attract more volumes. But I just wanted to highlight that the loans are just a more aggressive type of point of sale loans versus your traditional loans that Halyk would give. And if we were to look at the loan book differences, which would then speak to what I was speaking about now, you can see that BNPL, which are the interest-free loans which you pay in installments, think about it as like easy access loans, make up majority of Kaspi's fintech TFV. So what TFV is total financing value. So basically speaks to their loan book. So most of that is BNPL, and then the second biggest one will be just general purpose loans. And another one that is growing in the mix is actually the merchant and micro businesses loans. And then Halyk Bank, on the other hand, speaking also just to how traditional their model is, most of their loans is unsecured loans. So this speaks, I just want to highlight that this speaks to the retail loan book. They do have a corporate loan book, but if you were to look at specifically at the retail loan book, it's mostly just unsecured loans, mortgages, and what they have recently introduced, which Kaspi actually had first mover advantage, is the BNPL as well. So they do have that on their platform as of recent. And then the next one that I'll be looking at is the e-commerce landscape in Kazakhstan. And the reason why it's important is because we've spoken to Halyk being a traditional bank and then spoken to Kaspi being a lot more diversified. So they have the fintech, which is more the banking side, and then they have the payments and the e-commerce. So to understand both these companies, it would be also quite useful just to have a view on the e-commerce landscape currently. And then lastly, I'll look at the key financials between the two companies. So, if we were to look at like the retail e-commerce market overview, this is for the entire Kazakhstan market. You can see that a retail e-commerce market growth. So this would be like market size or gross merchandise value, total value for the country, has seen like high growth. The 4-year CAGR is actually around 55%. So each year they've been growing north of 30%. And then if you looked at like the share of e-commerce and retail trade, you can see that in the last 4 years they've actually grown. They've basically 3x, so like grown 3 times. They were around 5.1%, currently at 15.3% e-commerce penetration as a percentage of total retail trade. And if we were to compare those to global numbers are currently at 19.9%, so basically 20% penetration. So this just speaks to how underpenetrated e-commerce was relative to other emerging markets and how they've been able to ramp that up, almost close to what we are seeing like in other global markets. Just wanted to highlight also that this does speak to like a changing or like reflects the changes in purchasing structures in Kazakhstan. And just to look at e-commerce and what enables that is that it's quite important as well just to look at where the internet and digital payment penetration is. I just want to highlight that this is World Bank data, which goes through up until 2022. This is important to highlight because in 2022, you would see that the digital payment especially was around 77%, which was lower versus like other countries, like developed and developing countries. But since then, the National Bank of Kazakhstan actually had mentioned in our meetings that this has improved quite a lot. So the number that you see there was speaking to relative underpenetration. It might be still underpenetrated versus other countries, but there has been an improvement. But just wanted to highlight with the internet penetration as well that internet penetration is very high, very comparable to other developed markets. So this would just speak to the ease of consumers doing transactions on their phones. Also speaks to how like the positive e-commerce trends that we've been seeing as well. Kaspi as an ecosystem, because of their very diversified business model, it's very important to look at the ecosystem. As I had mentioned, that one of the revenue drivers is the ecosystem usage. So Kaspi is actually known as a super app. I have not met any other super app that's able to do what they do. So Justin, as an example, they do have a consumer facing app, which you and I would download to do like our everyday transactions, but they also have a merchant facing app, which businesses would have for different functionalities. But in the e-commerce, in the consumer facing app, there's a lot of functionalities that I could list, but important ones would be the e-commerce, which is basically a marketplace. M-commerce is basically offline, the point of sale that they have like in offline stores, and then there's e-groceries. You can even do your bill payments online. Basically, you can do anything on the app as a Kazakhstan consumer. And then on the merchant facing app, the merchants can have business accounts, but they can also do like Kaspi advertising to sort of advertise certain products that they want on their platforms. They can also do their tax reports, instant invoicing. So the functions for the two, or the interfaces for the two, are really useful for either the consumer or a merchant. And of recent, actually, in one of their management calls, they mentioned that you can also register a marriage on the app. So the functionalities of this app and what you can do is quite endless. And you could ask yourself, like, how much of a super app is it? So this is just a comparison between the functionalities in Kaspi when looking at the e-commerce, travel, advertising, payments, fintech, and govtech. And I mean, these are already like a lot of functionalities, but within each segment, you can see the different things that they're able to do. And it just compares it to companies like Tencent, companies like Allegro, Alibaba, which is big in China, but you can see that they basically have a lot of the functionalities versus what the other what the other apps have on their platforms. And an interesting way to look at how entrenched the consumer really is on the app is looking at the ratio of the DAU over MAU. What that is, it's basically the daily average user over the monthly average user. So it just sort of shows you the ratio of the percentage of people that use the app on a daily basis. And it's around 65%. The updated second quarter 2025 number is actually around 68%. So it just shows you that it has improved. And this is higher versus apps like WhatsApp, which is a chat app, and higher versus all the other apps. So it just speaks to how entrenched or how sticky the consumer really is on the platform and how they use it on a daily basis. And then, given what I've already mentioned on the daily average user, if you think about it, the population in Kazakhstan is 20 million people. So if they have a monthly average user of 14 million people, this speaks to more than 90% of Kazakhstan's adult population. So it does show you how entrenched they are in the market. But an interesting thing is that it's estimated that Kaspi processes around 60% of retail spent in Kazakhstan. So very important for the Kazakhstan consumer. But what's even more interesting is that it exceeds Visa's share in the US. And I will just speak to like them, exceeding Visa's share in the US also just speaks to how Caspi's fintech has been a huge disruption in the market, or their payment system rather. So just to give a bit of an explanation of how they've been able to have this much market share in Kazakhstan. So, Caspi's payment system has a closed loop system. In a normal transaction, usually you would have like a consumer with their bank card, and then you'll have a Visa, MasterCard, or Visa or MasterCard as like the middleman, and then you would have the merchant bank, and then so there's a lot of middlemen that are involved from like the beginning of the transaction till how the transaction closes. But with Kaspi, it's the consumer who would have like the Kaspi account, and then you have the Kaspi payment system. So there's the QR codes and there's the POSs that you would find in stores. But then the merchant as well, because they have the merchant facing app, also has a Kaspi account. So which means that they would have like an end-to-end system that does not need like Visa or MasterCard, and they're able to just have like take all the market share and not have to pay all the fees to all these middlemen. So you can imagine how much cheaper it is for them, but for the merchant as well. It just speaks to how much, how faster they can actually do the transaction. So they also, you would have seen like with the merchant facing side of the business, they do like have instant payments. So for most of the merchants, they like these POSs because of that options. So it's the cost side, but also the functionality and how most of the transactions actually clear instantly when you have like the Kaspi POSs. I mean, in South Africa, I'm not even aware of most of the POSs that you get in retail stores. But when you walk into a store in Almaty, Kazakhstan, it's actually quite evident who has majority market share, because most likely you are most likely to find a Kaspi or a Halyk Bank QR code or one of the POSs for payments. So these companies have majority market share, and for Kaspi specifically, with an end-to-end system, means that they get to take all the share and do not have to have middlemen taking up like some of the fees. So hence why they are a high margin business. But we speak about that as we go through the slides. And you can just think about how much data this company has, because it sees the full transaction without sharing it with any networks. So from the beginning to the end. Another thing that a lot of people, when they look at this company, and just something to think about, is that they already have majority market share. I mean, they already have 90% of the population. Like, what more can they really do? But an interesting thing is that we'll start with the consumer-facing app, which has around 14.7 million average users. And what this speaks to is just the percentage of people that use each functionality on a daily basis. So on the payment side, not on a daily basis, but who use the functionality basically. So on the payment side, the Kaspi QR and Kaspi cards, it just shows that 94% of the 14.7 million people on the platform already use this functionality. But if you were to look at the P2P, which is the peer-to-peer money transfers, only 37% of people use that. And then when you go to Marketplace, 43% of the people on the platform use the platform for e-commerce transactions for their marketplaces, but only 6% use that for e-groceries, which is basically being able to order groceries online. An example for us would be like your Checker 6060. So only 6% of the people on the platform do that. So this just speaks to the cross-selling opportunities that they have. So Kaspi has been known to introduce like a lot of functionalities, and it starts off from a low base, and people then it just gains traction and people use it. But I just wanted to highlight that there is still a lot of functionalities in payments, marketplaces, and fintech where they are still underpenetrated. We can speak the same for the merchant facing app, which has around 737,000 active merchants. And a lot of the merchants on the platform use this for the merchant acquiring platform, which is the POSs as well. And then they use this for the instant invoicing as well. But you can see there's an underpenetration when it comes to B2B payments. So this would be like a business paying their suppliers. And then if you were to look at the m-commerce for the marketplace, that's quite used at 41%, but Kaspi advertising has only like a 7% penetration in the number of active merchants. So it just shows that they can still cross-sell this product, or there's still a lot more opportunities for them to sell, cross-sell products. So it's not just in the population or the market share that they have, but just think about the products that they still have available to cross-sell. This can also be seen, or it also speaks, the cross-selling capabilities also speaks to how the business has actually evolved from being mainly like a fintech player, which is on the banking side, to more of a payments and marketplace platform. And you can see that the revenue contribution also has increased. But what has been even more interesting is that they do not just introduce these capabilities without thinking about profitability. Because if you look at the net income contribution, payments and marketplaces now contribute quite a significant amount to the profitability of the business. And the green line that you see there for both graphs, that would just be the year-on-year growth for the net income and revenue for the group. And then just wanted to also highlight another way to look at it. We've already spoken about the daily average user and how entrenched that is, but I just wanted to also mention that Halyk Bank, being a traditional bank, they do have they have tried their hand at a super app. So they also do have an app where people can do e-commerce and a lot of other functionalities, but they're not really focusing on that as a business. Their business is banking, but just wanted to highlight the differences in the daily average user. So if you look at that, for Kaspi, as I mentioned, is around 68% of people in the app use the app on a daily basis. But for Halyk Bank, it's around 32%. So it is quite low, but they are using it to drive a bit of traffic, but just wanted to highlight the differences between the daily average user on each of the platforms for the companies. This can also be seen in their GMV growth. So do not focus a lot on the GMV growth because they do do a lot of promotional activities. So there's a lot of seasonality that is involved in the growth. But what you do need to focus on is the total GMV over the years. So you can see that Caspi's GMV currently is around 1.2 billion versus 130 or 130 or so million for Halyk. So the GMV that they have or they're able to process on Caspi's platform is almost it's significantly bigger than what Halyk has currently. But then one thing to keep in mind again is that Halyk is a traditional bank and Kaspi really does focus on being a more diversified business model. But I think one thing to take into account is that despite the differences in the business models for Kaspi and Halyk, if we were to look at the net income growth over the years, you can see that they've been able to grow positively above the inflation. And then in the most recent quarters for Halyk specifically, as you would have seen with my inflation versus interest rate graph, they've been benefiting from rising rates and increased loan volumes given the traditional business versus Caspi's more diversified business. And there's a very high growth also just speaks to their returns as well. So if we were to look at the annualized returns for both Kaspi and Halyk, operating in the two business models, you can see how they've been able to drive like very high positive returns. Halyk's ROE at around 30%. It's very consistent with a stable, capital intensive bank. But if you think about Caspi's business and how they've been able to have such high returns, it's just reflective of a very high margin business. An example that I've spoken about is how they have like an end-to-end system where they do not need middlemen like Visa and MasterCard to be in the system. So they're able to have like or capture the high margin business. And it's a very like capital light model. So hence they have such high returns. So to conclude is that these businesses in their respective different models are able to drive high growth, are able to drive high margins, and are able to capture the market in their respective models. So that's what I wanted to highlight in today's teaching. And thank you to everyone who has been able to join today. And feel free to send in any questions that you might have, and we'll try to answer them today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Seipati. We do have some questions coming through, so maybe we can get going with those. Let me kick off with some Kaspi related questions. So the one question is, how is Kaspi managing growth in Kazakhstan with limited TAM, given they've already reached around 90% of the population?
So I think I've touched a little bit on it, but it just goes back to the cross-selling of products. So they've already reached, I think, TAM in the core products, which would be like your e-commerce and payments. But they've actually worked hard at introducing like new functionalities. An example would be like e-groceries. So you already have the consumer. The only thing that you have to do from here is just build up and introduce a new product. If the consumer is already entrenched, they're most likely, if they are like most likely to buy their phone on the platform, and clothes, they're most likely to also want to buy maybe their groceries on the platform. And if you have bill payments as well, meaning that they'll also are most likely to use the platform to pay for their bills, it just makes it easier for the consumer to have this one app where they can do everything. But to answer your question, is that it's just not about the TAM, but they've been able to cross sell a lot more products and just introduce a lot more functionalities from the core products that they already had.
Brilliant, thank you. And then maybe just speaking on Kaspi again, we're seeing them starting to expand internationally. Maybe you can give us some of the rationale behind the recent Turkish acquisition.
The rationale, I think, lies in yes, they are able to cross sell products, but it is highlighted in the slides that they've already reached like most of the population in Kazakhstan. So it's only natural to try see what else they can do internationally. I think the rationale for them is just looking at Turkey as a country. The TAM already that they would have there is just significantly significant versus what they have in Kazakhstan. For example, the population in Turkey is around 85 million versus Kazakhstan's 20 million population. So you can imagine what they can do with just a little bit of improvement in that market. And if we were to look at like the e-commerce penetration as well, it was higher for Turkey. It is higher for Turkey versus what they had in Kazakhstan. So it just shows that they'll be going into a country where they don't really have to start from scratch, but just have to build from an already available market. So the rationale is just to grow their TAM from what they already have in Kazakhstan. Yeah.
Thank you. And maybe just pivoting off of that, what lessons from Kazakhstan's rapid digital adoption could be applied to other emerging markets? I think what the user's trying to understand is, could Caspi's super app almost be successfully replicated in other emerging markets?
Yeah, so that's quite an interesting question that was also asked a lot at our conference. But if you've been in Caspi's management calls, I think they have been emphasizing the fact that they're not trying to replicate the market, especially with their new acquisition. But one thing that they do emphasize in Kaspi as a business is the net promoter score, which is basically how satisfied the customers are. Like at the core of the business, Kaspi really cares about the customer and the functionalities of the functions that they have on the platform and how that is useful for the customer. And if the customer is happy, you're almost likely to have a sticky customer. So now, if you think about it in terms of the recent acquisition or any other acquisition that they would do internationally, the way that they work at Kaspi is try to improve on what they already have. So like I said, the net promoter score, which is very important. So they've mentioned that they understand, for example, that other countries would be a lot more competitive than what they've already seen in Kazakhstan. But they are always looking at like low hanging fruits in the platforms that they would be acquiring. So just think of the business as not trying to 100% replicate what they have in Kazakhstan, but because of how efficient they've been able to run the business, it means that should they have any other platform anywhere else, they're able to see the low hanging fruits. They're able to see where they can improve, like customer satisfaction with the apps or any other functionalities that they can add that perhaps like other competitors in the market do not have, or how to like have functions that are a lot faster, a lot easier to work. So it's all about customer satisfaction for them, and then profitability comes from that, and consumer stickiness comes from that. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And then maybe last question from us. So Caspi's management team is often praised for their disciplined, measured approach to growth. How has that philosophy influenced Caspi's ability to scale? while maintaining profitability? And do you see that strategy evolving as they expand internationally?
Definitely, yes. So, it's. I think it also speaks to the last question that I just answered now, with them just focusing on net promoter scores and customer satisfaction. So, Caspi's management is quite open to speaking about maybe like functionalities that they've introduced on the platform that didn't work and they've had to drop. So they are not staunch on just keeping things that don't work. So they are quite focused, whatever that they introduced, they are quite focused on scaling it. And if they try scaling it and it doesn't work, they are never too strict to like try it. Like they will always like drop it and stick to things that work. So I think with that philosophy and that discipline, they will know when going into other markets, if they introduce things that don't work, how to quickly adapt to things that might work, how to quickly adapt to the markets the same way that they've been able to do in Kazakhstan. And because of the super app, I think, functionality that they have in Kazakhstan, they do so many things that in other countries that would be done by like a lot of different apps. But if you can have that functionality on one app, it means like they just have so much knowledge on data, how to use it, how to keep the customer engaged. So you can imagine what they're able to do with that in other countries, or in other emerging market countries, basically.
Awesome. Thank you so much. The session's been really, really informative. I think let's wrap it up here. So thank you very much, Seipati, for your information and insights today. And thank you to the audience for all the engagement and the questions. If you have any further questions or would like to continue the conversation, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to set that up. And yeah, thank you again for joining. We look forward to seeing you again. That will be on the 11th of September. We'll be looking at payments, specifically at Visa and MasterCard. Cool. Thank you, everyone.